So the subject I'm speaking on is who really is the faithful and discreet slave, because it's changed from time to time. So early on in 1881, Charles Russell wrote that it was the entire church, or the entire body of Christ, that fed one another. And there we go. We're just taking care of all of our technical difficulties here. But about 5 years later, Russell's wife started talking about how the fact that there in Matthew 24, in the 42 through whatever it is, where it says that this faithful and wise servant would be feeding the domestics or his fellow slaves, and later on would be appointed over all the Lord's belongings. Maria Russell made the case that because the term servant was singular and the term domestics and fellow slaves was a plural, that faithful and wise servant was a single individual. Now, she never actually came out and said that it was Charles Russell, but she left people to form the inevitable conclusion. And then it wasn't until 1927 that they actually clarified, which is a great word that the Watchtower uses, and you'll see it here in the presentation, that Russell, in fact, was not the faithful and discreet slave, but it was the remaining ones of the 144,000 on the earth. And that teaching continued up until, officially, until the July 15th, 2013 Watchtower, where they came out and said that the faithful and discreet slave was only the governing body. And there were several things that came up that ran up to that. Their annual meeting the year before, in 2012 in October, there were a couple of talks there that really spelled out the doctrine, and then it really wasn't formally published until July of 2013. So, Shay, if you could give me the stage. There we go. So, what I'm going to do is to spend a little time in that Watchtower where they announced this. If any of you get flashbacks, feel free to step outside for a moment. But I really struggled with this thing because the more I looked at it, I figured that this whole thing could be summed up in 6 words. It's a parable, not a prophecy. And so then, once that got into my head, as I was reading how they were explaining all of this stuff, I'm going, it's a parable, not a prophecy. But we'll take the Watchtower and look at this, and you'll see some of the wording that they use, and it's crazy. Okay, so this is from paragraph 2. It says, when giving signs of his presence, Jesus said that he would use the faithful and discreet slave to give food at the proper time to his domestics. It says, read Matthew 24, 45 to 47. No, Jesus didn't say that. If you read it, again, it was a parable about the master going away and coming back, finding the faithful slave doing what he was supposed to be doing, feeding the domestics. He didn't say that he would use a particular class of people. So he says that faithful slave is the channel through which Jesus is feeding true followers in this time of the end. And then this one just gives me the creeps. It is vital that we recognize the faithful slave. Our spiritual health and relationship with God depend on this channel. Now, you got to realize, too, that it is supposedly the faithful and discreet slave who is producing this. So they always put this stuff in passive voice and third person, as though they were talking about somebody else. But if you take that last phrase and put it as them speaking, which it is, in fact is, it would read something like, it is vital that you recognize us because your spiritual health and your relationship with God depend on us. That's literally what they're saying here if you cut through all of the wordsmithing. I said I was going to unplug that, didn't I, John? Sorry. So, it says, how then are we to understand Jesus' illustration? Where am I? About the faithful slave. He says, in the past, our publications have said the following. At Pentecost of 33 CE, Jesus appointed the faithful and discreet slave over his domestics. The slave represents all anointed Christians on earth at any one time since then. The domestics refer to the same anointed ones as individuals. How many of you were confused about that when you were witnesses? I was an elder, and I thought it was, okay, let me see. The faithful slave is them as a group. The domestics is them individual. Okay, whatever. So, and then it says in 1919, Jesus appointed the faithful slave over all his belongings. And so that's what they taught from about 1927 to 2013. And then a little later in the same paragraph, it says, however, further careful study and prayerful meditation indicate that our understanding of Jesus' words about the faithful and discreet slave needs to be clarified. Let us examine the illustration, how it involves us, whether we have the heavenly or earthly hope. I love that word, clarified. You know, they're about to say, what we taught you wasn't really true, but they don't want to come out and say that. So we're going to teach you something totally different. But we're just clarifying it a little. You know, it's like if I said, okay, Eric's shirt there is green. Oh, well, let me clarify. It's actually red. Well, that's quite a severe clarification. And I like what Rick Farron says. It goes, they tell you that they're going to tell you, then they tell you, and then they'll tell you that they told you. So then, later on, this was paragraph 7. I got quite a chuckle out of this. It says, think for a moment about the question, who really is the faithful and discreet slave? In the first century, there was hardly a reason to ask such a question. Then why did Jesus ask it? It says, as we saw in the preceding article, now this came at the end of 3 articles about feeding the many through the few. And he says, as we saw in the preceding article, the apostles could perform miracles and even transmit the miraculous gifts as proof of divine backing. So why would anyone need to ask who really was appointed by Christ to take the lead? Well, that's 2 different questions, who the slave is and who Christ appointed to take the lead, but they see them as the same question. And again, if the question didn't need to be asked, why would Jesus ask it? Now, it's interesting that the Watchtower almost exclusively quotes Matthew's account of this, where the question, who really is the faithful and discreet slave, seems to just pop out of nowhere. I mean, he's in this middle of this discussion about the need to keep watchful, to keep in anticipation of his return, and then seemingly out of nowhere, this rhetorical question, who really is the faithful and discreet slave? But if you look at it in Luke, there's a little more context there because Jesus is the same discussion about being in anticipation of his return. And then Peter asked the question, Lord, are you saying this to us or to everybody? And Jesus does this great, it's a Jewish thing. You answer a question with a question. You know, it's like the guy, his wife says, how come you always answer a question with a question? He says, do I do that? So, and when you look at the account in Mark doesn't even mention the faithful and wise servant. So then here comes the major clarification. Do all the anointed on earth make up the faithful slave? No. The reality is that not all anointed ones have a role in dispensing spiritual food to fellow believers worldwide. Now this was really sneaky because for years, the governing body really excluded the rest of the anointed from having a part in creating the spiritual food, and now they're using that as a reasoning as to why they're not really the slave. I had a discussion several years ago now with a witness in Australia via email, and he was one of the anointed. We get talking about the subject of being born again, and he's just a great guy. I really enjoyed talking with him. I've since kind of lost track of him. But in talking about the experience of being born again, we found out we had more in common than we had differences. So one day I asked him, I says, as an elder, as a former elder, I feel a certain responsibility for having had a part in propagating that whole system and the teachings and all of that. And I says, I don't want to be disrespectful, and I'm not in any way making light of this, but I need to ask you, as one of the 144,000, as one of the faithful and discreet slave, how do you feel about your role in this whole thing? And he came back and said, I feel totally disconnected and totally disenfranchised. And in reading stuff from other people who were witnesses who claimed to be of the anointed, there was pretty much that same feeling. And when you look at the whole teaching, it's kind of an odd thing. It's a teaching that works really well in theory, but when you put a face on it, sometimes it doesn't work so well. Sometimes some of the people who claim to be of the anointed, how shall I say this, have some interesting personalities. You look at them and go, yeah, Jehovah chose you to be priest and king over me, and and I think sometimes the elders, circuit overseers, district overseers, had problems with people who claimed to be of the anointed, of various types, and so at this point, they came out with this new definition. So they kind of took care of the problem all at once. Now, those who claim to be of the anointed, I don't know, it's like they got a demotion. I don't want to put it quite that crassly, but they're no longer part of the faithful and discreet slave. So anyway, it talks about among the wheat are anointed brothers who may serve as ministerial servants and elders in the local congregation. They teach from house to house in their congregations, loyally support the direction from headquarters, but they do not have a part in dispensing spiritual food to the worldwide brotherhood. It's an odd phrase because when they go door to door, the Watchtower, aren't they dispensing? But of course here they mean not really dispensing, but coming up with it. And then also among the anointed are humble sisters who would never try to assume the role of teachers in the congregation. I'm not going to go there. So, it says, who then are the faithful and discreet slave? In keeping with Jesus' pattern of feeding the many through the hands of a few, that slave is made up of a small group of anointed brothers who are directly involved in preparing and dispensing spiritual food during Christ's presence. Throughout the last days, the anointed brothers who make up the faithful slave have served together at headquarters. In recent days, that slave has been closely identified with the governing body. Again, interesting wordsmithing. They didn't want to say the faithful and discreet slave is the governing body, but it has been closely identified with the governing body. Now, again, that kind of passive voice comes in. Really what they're saying is, in the past decades, we have closely identified the faithful and discreet slave with the governing body because they're the ones who are dispensing all of this. So then it says, it's noteworthy that in Jesus' illustration, the faithful and discreet slave receives two distinct appointments. The first is over the domestics. The second is over the master's belongings. Since the illustration is fulfilled only in the time of the end, both appointments would have come after Jesus' kingly presence in 1914. And I'm not going to bore you with all of the convoluted explanation of this, but basically what they're saying is that in 1919, the slave was appointed to feed the domestics. And then later on, at Jesus' coming during the Great Tribulation, they're saying, they're appointed over all the belongings. So it used to be that they were already appointed over us, because we were the belongings back then. Now, whereas the remaining ones of the anointed kind of got a demotion, a lot of us came out on the good end of this, and you'll see why in the next paragraph. This was actually a sidebar. It says, was Jesus foretelling that there would be an evil slave class in the last days? No. Now, it used to be that those who had professed to be of the anointed that had fallen away made up the evil slave class. And early in my journey out of the Watchtower, I actually met with the Associated Bible students. And I went to one of their conferences, and they were still a little too Watchtowery for me, but great people. But the guy that I was interacting with online says, oh, we have two ladies here from the Dawn Bible students. The Dawn Bible students are like the publishing house for all of the Bible student groups. And so he takes me over to meet these two little white-haired grannies. And he introduced me to them and said, this is Bob Gray. He's a former Jehovah's Witness. And one of them, with just this mischievous little glint in her eyes, she says, so how does it feel to meet the evil slave? But so anyway, I guess Rick came out good on this because he's not evil slave anymore. He said that, where are we? Some individuals have manifested a spirit similar to that of the evil slave described by Jesus. And says we would call them apostates, whether they were of the anointed or the great crowd. But such ones don't make up an evil slave class. Jesus did not say that he would appoint an evil slave. His words here are actually a warning directed to the faithful and discreet slave. So if he returned in 1914, looked around at all the religions, and found this group of faithful people, and it took him 4 years to do it, 5 years, from 1914 to 1919, and then had so much confidence in them that he appointed them to feed all of the domestics, why would he need to warn them about becoming an evil slave? There's a lot of other questions that come up in this whole thing. Then this paragraph, they seem to be throwing a bone to the anointed that just got the demotion, because it asked the question, do the faithful slave receive a greater reward in heaven than the rest of the anointed? It says no. A reward promised to a small group in one setting may ultimately be shared by others. For example, consider what Jesus said to his 11 faithful apostles, the night before he died. Jesus promised that small group of men that a fine reward awaited them for their faithfulness. They would share his throne of kingly authority. But years later, he indicated that all the 144,000 would sit on thrones and share his rulership. Read those scriptures. He doesn't exactly say that. He said he promised that a small group of men, the anointed brothers who make up the faithful slave, will be appointed over all his belongings. In reality, all of the 144,000 will share the heavenly authority. You read the scriptures, they don't support that at all. This whole article really, more so than normal, they make these statements that just are not supported by the scriptures they cite. So then, the last paragraph that we'll cover of this. It says, by means of the faithful and discreet slave, Jesus is following the pattern he set in the first century, feeding many through the hands of a few. Jesus appointed that faithful slave to ensure that his genuine followers, whether the anointed or the other sheep, would have a steady supply of timely spiritual food throughout the last days. Let us be determined to show our appreciation by giving our loyal support to the anointed brothers who make up that faithful and discreet slave class. Basically, again, they're saying you need to show your appreciation for what we just told you by being loyally supporting us. So just a couple of questions, and Keith, I would love to hear you ask some of these So first of all, if the faithful slave was not appointed to feed the domestics until 1919, was Russell an illegitimate feeder? An undocumented feeder, if you will? And it's interesting, by saying that the slave wasn't appointed until 1919, it was a few years after Russell was dead, they really kind of cut off any appeal they could make to Russell as, starting this whole thing and being the real one that was originally appointed. Because in 1919, Rutherford was like the king. And the governing body, I was just coming in the mid-'70s, and that's really when the governing body really became the governing body. Before that, they just called them, the directors of the Watchtower corporations? So that being the case, who was it that was actually appointed in 1919? If it's the governing body now, and there wasn't a governing body there, who got appointed? And then, if the idea of Russell being the faithful slave wasn't cleared up until 1927, how is it that Jehovah appointed a slave in 1919, but didn't clarify who they were till 18 years later, and then clarified it again 86 years after that? You would think if it were the faithful and discreet slave, they'd at least know who they were. So to sum it up again, it's a parable, not a prophecy. Isn't it good to be free of that? I look back at this now and I shudder to think how ingrained this was in me, because this teaching, once you convince somebody of the faithful and discreet slave teaching, you can literally tell them anything. And recently they've had some stuff, where they said, in the last days when things are really getting tough, you need to be ready to obey, even if what you're hearing doesn't make sense from a human standpoint. That says Kool-Aid to me. It's just a dangerous thing. So anyway, I just wanted to take some time, go through that. I'll wrap that up. It just, the thing is so silly that I can only look at it and just laugh at it. Amazing that God has gotten all of us out of that, and we serve a risen Savior, not a self-described faithful and discreet slave. So Eric, you had some